How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yomi, Daf 14 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, you start thinking about your Purim costume yet? What is it? We're in Shvat, right? It was like you still have like probably 5 weeks. Hillel, what are you doing? Yeah. Hillel, you always have like a good costume for Purim. Yeah, you know what you're doing yet? Or are you like a last minute kind of guy? I think I have an idea. The last few years I've been doing like a Babble on Talmud theme. When was it? What was I last year? Last year I was who was it? The three people in the Kivshan Aish. The year before that I was Bob Mitzia. The year before that I was a sunflower person. I have an idea this year. Akoponim. What are you guys thinking? You have ideas already? Okay. Daf 14 of Masechta Menachos. Partial pigul. Interesting question. Right? What if you, by the Shtei Alechem, for example, you have intention to eat one of the breads chutz l'zmanu. Shtei Alechem obviously is 2 breads. You have intention to eat one of the breads chutz l'zmanu, but not the other one. Oh, they both pigul? Is just that one bread pigul? So partial pigul is an interesting one. And how about this? Partial half pigul. Oh boy. No, it's not as complicated as it sounds, but I just need to remember what that is. Nachon. Like if you do shchita with the intention of like eating half a zayis l'mocher, then you do zrika with like another half a zayis. So like, can the two things join together? Anyways. But it should be an interesting daf. There's a very dramatic first Amud. The first Amud is dramatic, where we have this very interesting shita of Rabbi Yossi that we're delving into and questioning. And friends, let's jump in to Daf Yudalid of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we begin on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis at the Mishnah about 15 or so lines from the bottom. About 3 or 4 lines into the wide lines. On Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis says the Mishnah, Shachat shnei kvasim lechol achas min achalis l'mocher. Shtei Alechem. Who wants to tell us what Shtei Alechem are? Shtei Alechem is the korban that was offered on Shavuos. Shtei Alechem were 2 loaves of wheat bread. And once they were offered, now Chodosh was allowed to be offered in the Beis HaMikdash. Of course, there's the halacha of Chodosh, that all new grain of the year is not allowed to be eaten. So basically any grain that took root since the Omer of the previous year, right, since essentially the 16th of Nisan of the previous year, any grain that took root, and even the Chameshas Minei Dagon that took root subsequent, I think that means after the 16th of Nisan of the previous year. So when they are harvested, they can't be eaten yet. You have to wait until the Minchas HaOmer is offered on the 16th day of Nisan. That allows the new crop to be eaten by the regular people in the pizza shops, in the bakeries, right? Sometimes we see on a pizza shop or a bakery, we use kemach yoshon. So to make sure that all grain flours or all grain that's being used is only post the 16th of Nisan. Now, in the Beis HaMikdash, the new grain was still not used until Shavuos. On Shavuos, the Shtei Alechem korban was offered. It's a type of mincha. The Shtei Alechem was offered on Shavuos. And once the Shtei Alechem was offered on Shavuos, then the new crop was allowed also in the Beis HaMikdash for Menachos and things like that. Now, along with the Shtei Alechem, along with these 2 wheat breads, were 2 keveses, 2 sheep as shlomim. These were shalmei tzibor. These were public shlom offerings. As far as I'm aware, these are the only sort of standard public shlomim offerings. If anybody has other examples, let me know. But I think that during the Miluim and the Chanukah Mishkan, I think there were other communal shlamim offerings, but as like a standard annual, throughout the year, Shalmei Tzibor, I'm only aware of these. These were 2 sheep, and they were the matir for the Shtei Alechem. That after these 2 sheep were offered, now the Shtei Alechem could be eaten by the Kohanim. Now, what happened here was the Kohen who was shechting the sheep for the Kivsei Atzeres had intention to eat one of the 2 Shtei Alechems, one of the lechems chutz lizmanu, but only one of the 2. The other one, he says, I'm going to eat it. One of them I'm going to eat out on time. The other one, not on time. Save it for later. Save it for another time. Chutz lizmanu. So that's what we're talking about. When there's a kavana of chutz lizmanu, but only for one of the Shtei Alechem. Again, shochat shnei kvasim, so the 2 kivsei atzeres were slaughtered. Lechol achas min achalis, to eat one of the 2 Shtei Alechem, one of the Shtei Alechem, lemocher, the next day. That was the kavanah. For one of them, there was a kavanah of chutz lizmanu. For the other, all gravy. Alternatively, hiktir shnei bazichin lechol echod min asdorim lemocher. Another riff on this theme is by the showbreads, by the lechem aponim. Diana sent me a meme about the showbreads from The Godfather. Well, what did it say? It said, you take the frankincense, leave the showbreads, or something like that. It's like when they remove Paulie and they say, take the cannolis or something. Okay. All right. I'll go put him. So, where are we? So, the showbreads. So, of course, as we know by now, Baruch Hashem, Chevra, I'm so proud of us. We know so much about Korbanos and Menachos now. It's unbelievable. Anyways, so the showbreads, there were, of course, the 12 showbreads that we eat in every Shabbos. Now, the bazichin, the offering of the 2 kalim, the 2 bozochs, vessels of frankincense, they would be offered on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. When they were offered on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, that would allow the showbreads to be eaten by the Kohanim. Now, the showbreads, of course, were 2 stacks of showbreads, right? 2 stacks, six showbreads each. So similarly here, if the bazichin were burnt on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, and the intention when burning the bazichin was that one of the stacks will be in chutz lizmanu, will be in tomorrow, for example. So here's the machlekes. So again, starting over. Shochat shnei kvasim lechol achas min achalis lemachar, by the Shtei Alechem, one of the breads was going to be in the next day. Hikdir shnei bazichin, both bozochs of frankincense by the Shtei Alechem, by the lechem aponim, were burnt lechol echol min asdorim lemachar, with the intention of eating one of the stacks of showbreads the next day. Chutz lizmanu, Rabbi Yossi, Omesis Rabbi Yossi, also achala, so that one bread of the Shtei Alechem, the also haseder, and that one stack of showbreads, shechishav olav, that there was a machshavas chutz lizmanu, pigul. So that one Shtei Alechem, that one stack of showbreads is pigul. But v'chayev olav chorus, v'chayev chorus if you eat it. The asheni, but the second one where the thoughts were kosher, Vasheni posel, so the second one is posel. Then go bokaris, but there's not going to be any chiyuv karis there. There's no chiyuv karis there, but don't eat it. V'chacham zevas a pigul b'chayv of karis, whereas the chacham don't make such a chiluk. Instead, the chacham say that they are both pigul. Right? If you have kavana to eat one of the Shtei Alechem chutz lizmanu, both Shtei Alechem are pigul. You have kavanah to eat one of the stacks of showbreads chutz lizmanu, both stacks of showbreads are pigul. One of the showbreads, right? One stack of showbreads, right? Lechem aponim. So then both stacks are pigul. Okay. Givaldik. I have a little coffee here. I'm going to take a schluck and we'll go weiter. Givaldik. Says the Gemara. We're going to see a very interesting shita now of Rav Huna. Very, very interesting shita of Rav Huna. And boy, are we going to go to town on this shita of Rav Huna. Rav Huna or Mahai Reb Yossi says Rav Huna that Reb Yossi would, okay, so Rav Huna claims that Reb Yossi would say, Pigul b'yerech shel yomin lo nispaga yerech shel smol. Do you hear this? Big chiddush. Big chiddush. Rav Huna claims that Reb Yossi's opinion would be that if you have a korban, I don't know what kind of korban. I don't know, korban chatas? I think that could work. That if a kohen slaughters a korban chatas with the intention to eat the right thigh, chutz l'zmanu. So Rabbi Yossi would say, right, just like he said by the shtei lechem, by the lechem aponim, right, if you have kavanah for one of the shtei lechem or for one of the stacks of lechem aponim, only that shtei lechem or only that stack of lechem aponim would be pigul, the other would not be pigul. Rav Huna wants to say that Rabbi Yossi would say that even within an animal itself, you can have kavanah that the right thigh should be pigul, and that's it, just the right thigh. Or you could have kavanah, right, that I'm going to eat the right thigh tomorrow, right? Chutz l'zmanu. And the Rabbi Yossi would say that only that right thigh is pigul, the rest of the animal, not pigul. Again, Amar Rav Huna says, Rav Yossi would say, Pigul b'yerech shel yomin, if there was machshavas chutz l'zmanu by the right thigh, lo nispag b'yerech shel smol, the left thigh is not pigul. My time I could explain this to either with my noggin or by quoting verses. If you want to hear from my noggin, this is what I will say. Well, my thoughts should be no different than the animal becoming tame. Ilu itame chad aver mi itami le kule. That if you had a korban and it was like cut up, and one of the limbs becomes tummy, only that limb is tummy, not the rest of the animal. So also, if I have a machshava that the right thigh should be pigul, machshava to eat the right thigh chutz l'zmanu, so it's limited to the right thigh, but the rest of the korban is kosher, or at least is not pigul. That is the noggin approach. Or I could quote you a verse. Mimenu avonatisa. It says by pigul that the soul who eats from it, so i.e., mimenu v'lo mechaver, right? Right from it, right? This part of the korban, if you eat it, will be pigul, but the another part of the korban that if you eat it might not be pigul. Mimenu, from it, a subset of it would be pigul. For example, if you have machshavas chutz l'zmanu just for the right thigh. Okay. That is the shita of Rav Huna. We're going to go to town on this shita. But Rav Huna's claim is that Rabbi Yossi would say that even within an animal, a machshavas chutz l'zmanu for the right thigh means that only the right thigh would be pigul, the rest of the animal would not be pigul. The left thigh would not be pigul. Big chiddush. Within an animal itself, one thigh could be pigul while the other one is not. Here we go. We're going to town. You ready? Esvei of Nachman, the Rav Huna of Nachman, asks a kasha against Rav Huna. La'olam ein bo karis ad shifagul b'shtein b'chazayis. Okay. This is talking about shtei alechem. And we're saying that the second bread is only going to be pigul if you have kavana to eat a kazayis from both breads chutz l'zmanu. Meaning, if you have the shtei alechem, So Rabbi Yossi, of course, had said in our Mishnah that by the Shtei Alechem, if you have kavanah of chutz zmanu by one of the breads, so only that bread will be pigul, the other one won't. And we're saying that it's the second bread is only going to be pigul if you have at least kavanah to eat a half a zayis from Ruvain the Shtei Alechem, Ruvain the bread, and half a zayis of Shimon the bread, chutz lizmanu. Kilu, if you only have kavanah about Ruvain the bread, so then Shimon the bread will not be pigul. Shimon the bread will only be pigul if you have at least kavanah of to eat half a zayis of Ruvain the bread and half a zayis of Shimon the bread, for a total of a full zayis between Ruvain and Shimon the bread, chutz lizmanu. Okay, fine. Again, the olam ein bo kares. There's not going to be kares for Shimon the bread. At sheyifagel b'shtein b'chazayis. You have to at least have machsheves pigul chutz lizmanu for a kazayis between both Reuben and Shimon the bread. Let's say a kazayis of Reuben the bread and a kazayis of Shimon the bread chutz lizman. B'shtein in b'achas man lo. We're saying that if the kavanah of chutz lizmanu was between both of the breads, so then there's a chiyuv kares for Shimon the bread. But if there was only kavanah's chutz lizmanu for Reuven the bread, Shimon the bread would not be pigul. Money, whose opinion is this? Well, this brisa is clearly not, or at least we want to argue, is clearly not the rabbis, because the rabbis, as we saw in our Mishnah, if there's machshavas chutz lizmanu just for Reuven the bread, doesn't matter. They're both going to be, both Shtei Alechem are going to be pigul. So who's the one who's saying that if it was, the kavanah was only for Reuven the bread, then Shimon the bread would not be pigul? So, Elipshita Rabbi Yossi. Okay, must be Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so now let's go deeper. Okay. Okie dokie. Now, here's the question against Rav Huna. In order to understand this brisa that we're saying is Rabbi Yossi, right, with the two half zayises, or right, with the zayis from Reuben the bread and Shimon the bread, Shtei Alechem. So now if we reflect back on the animal whose right leg was intended to be eaten chutz lizmanu, but whose left leg was intended to be eaten on time. So by that animal, it's all one body, it's all one guf, it's all one body. So I understand if we say unlike Rav Huna, I would understand if we say that since, let's call it Ruvain the sheep, okay, we have Reuven the bread, we have Shimon the bread, we have Reuven the sheep. I understand if we say that Reuven the sheep is all one body, to the extent that if I have machsheves chutz lizmanu for Reuven the sheep's right leg, well, that's basically I have machsheves chutz lizmanu for Reuven the sheep, for the entirety of Reuven the sheep. And the left leg will also be pigul. I understand that. So if we say that since Reuven the sheep is all one, well, actually no, this is, if we're talking about a korban chat, I say we're talking about korban chat, Sarah the sheep. So I understand if Sarah the sheep is all one guf, is all one body, and therefore a machsheves chutz lizmanu for Sarah the sheep's right leg is a machsheves chutz lizmanu for the entirety of Sarah the sheep, for Sarah the sheep's left leg also, the whole Sarah the sheep. So then I can also understand what's going on with the Shtei Alechem, because there's a very interesting thing going on with the Shtei Alechem. Because Rabbi Yossi had said in the Mishnah that if the machshavas chutz lizmanu was just for Reuven the bread, well then Shimon the bread is not pigul. I.e., that Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread are separate. That I can have machshavas chutz lizmanu just for Reuven the bread, while leaving Shimon the bread unpiggled. And yet, we're also saying at the same time that they can at the same time join together and be considered one unit such that if I have machshavas chutz lizmanu for a half a zayis of Reuven the bread and for a half a zayis of Shimon the bread, they'll join together and make both breads entirely pigul. How so? Well, again, if we say that the way that our perspective on Sarah the sheep is that it's all one body, and therefore machshavas chutz lizmanu for Sarah the sheep's left leg is a machshavas chutz lizmanu for Sarah the sheep's right leg, or vice versa, whatever. Well, now I can explain what's happening here with the shtei alechem. That when I have kavana for the shtei alechem to be one unit, one guf, and that I'm having machshavas chutz lizmanu for half a zayis of Reuven the bread and for half a zayis of Shimon the bread, and that they join together because they're one guf, givaldig. And when I only have machshavas chutz lizmanu for Reuven the bread, but not for Shimon the bread, because I'm viewing them not as one guf, but as two separate gufs. So then Shimon the bread remains unpiggled. So kilu, if we say that when you're dealing with one guf, so then the whole guf becomes pigul, I get it. That's how I can explain Rabbi Yossi, that when we're viewing the two breads as being separate, so I can have machshava just for one bread and leave the other one unpiggled. But when I'm joining them together and viewing them as one guf, so then a machshava is chutz lizmanu for half a zayis of this and half a zayis of that, half a zayis of Reuven the bread and half a zayis of Shimon the bread will join together as one guf and make the whole shtei alechem pigul. But elai all my trei gufa ninu. But if we say, like Rav Huna is saying, that even within Sarah the sheep, we can view Sarah the sheep's right leg as a separate guf, as Sarah the sheep's left leg. Well, then, by the shtei alechem, we should view Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread as separate. How could they join together? Ho. Friends, what do you say? You say excited for this daf? We literally just started. How many minutes are we in? Oh boy, we're about 25 minutes into daf. We're just getting up to the first line of your Dalet. Okay, buckle up. Okay, fine. Eliyamar Trey Gufa. I think it might start speeding up picking up speed at some point. But as I pointed out recently, I've lost all credibility of gauging how long things take. Eliyamar Trey Gufa ninu mimit started. Then how can they join together? And how can we understand this brisa with the kazayis of Reuven the bread and the kazayis of half a zayis of Reuven the bread and half a zayis of Shimon the bread joining together? So it says the Gemara, well, actually, one second. Let's defend Rav Huna and say Rav Huna can stay with Sarah the sheep's right leg being separate from Sarah the sheep's left leg, because Amani Rebbe, that the author of this braise with the half a zayis of Reuven the bread and half a zayis of Shimon the bread is Rebbe. The Sanya that we learn in a braise, Ashoichet des akeves lechol chatzi zayis michala zoi v'kein chaveru lechol chatzi zayis michala zoi Rebbe Omer Ani shezeh kosher. That this again has to do with the shtei alechem. The shtei alechem, you have two breads, of course, and there's also the two sheep, the kivsei atzeres. Now, the kivsei atzeres are matir the shtei alechem. Now, in a scenario where you slaughter one, let's say, these are shlomim. Now, shlomim, I imagine that these could be male or female. I imagine shlomim, generally speaking, can be either male or female. I don't know if it's different by shalmei tzibur, which are kachim kachim. I don't know, but whatever it says, kivsei atzeres, so keves. Let's say that it's male. So Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep. I think that's fine. We have Reuven the bread, Shimon the bread, Reuven the sheep, Shimon the sheep. That's fine. So where were we? So you have Reuven the sheep, Shimon the sheep, Reuven the bread, Shimon the bread. Shtei alechem, kivsei atzeres. You offer the kivsei atzeres with the shtei alechem. Now, if you slaughter Reuven the sheep with the intention of eating a half zayis of Reuven the bread, chutz lizmanu, and then you slaughter Shimon the sheep with the intention of eating half a zayis of Shimon the bread, chutz lizmanu. Here's the thing, friends. Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep together are the matir for the shtei alechem. The Kohanim can only eat the shtei alechem once Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep have been offered. Each one is only a chatzi matir. Each one is only half of what's necessary to allow the shtei alechem to be eaten. So essentially, what do you have here? You have half a matir, Reuven the sheep, or Shimon the sheep, and half an achila. Achila is bikazais. So basically, you're basically slaughtering Reuven the sheep with the intention of eating half a kazais of Reuven the bread, chutz lizmanu. So that's half a matir and half achila. And then you have kavana when slaughtering Shimon the sheep to eat half a kazais of Shimon the bread, chutz lizmanu. Again, half a matir, half an achila. Rebbe says nothing to worry about. The shtei alechem is kosher, all good. Because you had half a matir, half achila. So, right, each kavanah was just for each intention was half a matir, half an achila. Now, so Omer Ani, I say shezeh kosher. There's nothing to worry about by the shtei alechem. However, the Gemara is medayik. Time of the Omer chatzi chatzi. The reason why Rebbe says there's nothing to worry about, it's a kosher, right, the shtei alechem is kosher, is because we're talking about half a matir and half an achila. Avol, Omar, kazayis mishteyen. However, if his intention was that when slaughtering both Reuven and Shimon the sheep, the intention was to eat a kazayis from both of them, right? So you slaughter Reuven the sheep and says, I'm going to eat a kazayis from Reuven the bread. I'm going to eat half a zayis from Reuven the bread as well as half a zayis from Shimon the bread, i.e. a kazayis total from both Reuven and Shimon the bread, chutz lizmano. And he had this kavanah when slaughtering Reuven the sheep, when slaughtering Shimon the sheep, to eat a kazayis from composed of Reuven and Shimon the bread, chutz lizmano. Mitzvah. In that case, Rebbe would say that would be pigul, right? Where both Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread would both be pigul, like our brisa says. So we want to say that our brisa is Rebbe, but says the Gemara, Rebbe aliba daman. But who is Rebbe? Who is his shita aligned with? Is he aligned with the perspective of the Rabbanon, or is he aligned with the perspective of Reb Yossi? Yaliba the Rabbanon, if Rebbe is saying his shita that we just quoted aligned with the rabbi's perspective, well then afilu ba'achas me'en nami. Well, the rabbis had said even if you had kavana of chutz lizmanu for just Reuven the bread, still Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread would both be pigul, as we know already from the Mishnah. It was the Chavanas chutz lizmanu just for Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread are pigul. So this brisa can't be the Rabbanan, as we pointed out earlier. And at the same time, aliba de Rabbi Yossi hadja kusha leduchton. But at the same time, if we say that Rebbe is based on the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, well, we've been there, done that. If we say that brisa is Rabbi Yossi, well then in order for it's based on Rabbi Yossi, so in order for it to make sense, you're going to have to say that when they're one goof, so then it's all considered one goof and it's all joins together. Well then, how could Rav Huna claim that Rabbi Yossi would say that you can have machshavas chutz lizmanu just for the right leg, independent of the left leg? So what's the dilio? Still, how do we understand this brisa in a way that would still leave room for Rav Huna's opinion? So the olam aliv de rabban. Okay, so we want to say, okay, look, I'll tell you. really this brayso has nothing to do with Rebbe, it's the rabbi's opinion. Okay. But then why are we saying that you need to involve both breads in order for them both to be pigul? Rabbis would say even machshava just for Reuven, the bread would make them both pigul. V'lo tema'achi fagil b'shteihen. You ready for this, friends? Don't say that for them both to be pigul, you need to have machshavas chutz zmano for both Reuven and Shimon. B'shteihen. Shteihen is female, referring to the chalas. Don't say it's shteihen, referring to the chalas, that you need to have machshavas chutz zmano by both Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread. Rather, fagel b'shneihen. Shneihen is male, a reference to the kevises, to Reuven and Shimon, the sheep. So what it's saying is that you can, in terms of Reuven and Shimon the bread, you can have machshavas pigul for just Reuven the bread, and that would make them both pigul. You don't need shteyen. You don't need both of the chalas. You don't need to have machshavas chutz lizmano for both Reuven and Shimon the bread. Or maybe Sarah and Rivka the bread, but I'm not going to do that to you, friends. I'm a nice guy. Reuven and Shimon the bread. But you do need to have this kavanah for both Reuven and Shimon the sheep, because they are both the matir. And if you would only have machshavas chutz zmanu for Reuven when slaughtering Reuven the sheep, but not for Shimon the sheep, that's only a chatzi matir, and the rabbis hold ein mipaglim b'chatzi matir. So again, you'd have to have machshavas chutz zmanu when slaughtering both Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep. But in terms of Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread, even if you have machshavas pigul for just Reuven the bread, both breads are pigul, according to the rabbis. And even if the machshavas pigul was only for Reuven the bread, not for Shimon the bread, nonetheless both are pigul. And this comes to exclude, as opposed to the opinion of Reb Meir the Omer, who says mefaglim b'chatzi matir. That Reb Meir says mefaglim b'chatzi matir, that even a machshavas chutz lizmano when slaughtering just Reuven the sheep could already affect pigul, because even though it's only half of the matir, right? You need Reuven and Shimon the sheep in order to be matir the shtei alechem. And here the machshavas pigul was only for Reuven the sheep. Nonetheless, mefaglim b'chatzi matir, that can affect pigul. According to Reb Meir, komaj malon dilo. And come the rabbis to say that nisht. You would have to have machshavas chutz zmano when slaughtering both Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep. But again, a machshavas chutz zmano when slaughtering Reuven and Shimon the sheep about just Reuven the bread would be machshavas pigul for both of the shtei alechem, Reuven and Shimon the bread. Iochi, my leolam. So the Gemara asked an interesting question, that the brisa that we had quoted about the half azayas of pigul from Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread, which we just explained according to the rabbis. The thing is, that brisa, what did it say? It said an interesting word, an important word. A word a word that is going to make or break the opinion. Leolam ein bokaris ad shifagel b'shtein b'kizayis. Interesting. Leolam. Never. I don't know. Leolam means, right, because we're talking about Shimon the bread here. And the brisa says, Shimon the bread will never be pigul until. That's kind of an extreme way of saying things, right? We're saying basically, until all of the following criteria are met, Shimon the bread will not be pigul. Le'olam means like we're going to go as far as we can. We're going to have as many pile on the criteria, and that Reuven le'olam, Shimon the bread will never be pigul until all of these criteria are met. So I understand if this is according to Rabbi Yossi, who says that Shimon the bread is never going to be pigul until there's machshavas chutz zmanu, not just for Reuven the bread, but also for Shimon the bread. Okay, I understand. Le'olam kilu shim in the bread is never going to be pigul until there's machshavas chutz zmano, not just for ruva in the bread, but also shim in the bread. Only then will shim in the bread be pigul. But if we're explaining this according to the rabbis who said, nah, even when you have machshavas chutz zmano just for ruva in the bread, shim in the bread is already pigul. Well, then what's le'olam? Shim in the bread is never going to be pigul until you have machshavas chutz zmano for ruva in the bread. That's it. Shim in the bread, that's not like I never until. So therefore, says the Gemara, right? So what's the olam? Bishlama b'shtein uvishnein Rabbi Yossi. So I understand if we say that the Bryce is Rabbi Yossi, and it's saying that shim in the bread is never going to be pigul until Bishtayin and Bishnein are met. Bishtayin, which is female, referring to the chalas, that you have to have machshavas chutz lezmano by both, right? Bishtayin by both chalas to eat a kazayis of Ruvain, or at least to eat from Ruvain the bread chutz lezmano, as well as from Shimon the bread chutz lezmano, as well as Bishnein, that you have to have this machshava not just for Ruvain the sheep, but also for Shimon the sheep. So I understand according to Rabbi Yossi, it's taking it to the extreme that you have to have machshavas chutz zmanu by both Reuven and Shimon the sheep, and by Reuven and Shimon the bread. Ulakfuke midur Rab Meir, to exclusion of Rab Meir, who says mefagan b'chatzi matir just by Reuven the sheep. Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep. Umidur Rabbanon, and to exclusion of the rabbis who say that it can be pigul even if it's just by Reuven the sheep, Reuven the bread would already make Shimon the bread pigul. And he would say, Rabbi Yossi is saying is you need to have machshavas chutz zmanu by Reuven and Shimon the bread. So that okay, I can understand why it says le'olam. It's never going to be pigul by Shimon the bread until all of these criteria are met. Shtein and Shnein. And that's it. But if we explain the Bryce according to the rabbis who say, okay, it's the exclusion of Rab Meir, that you have to have machshavas chutz zmanu by both Reuven and Shimon the sheep. But in terms of Reuven and Shimon the bread, you just have to have machshavas pigul for Reuven the bread, and that will count for Shimon the bread as well. My la'olam, that's not really it's less dramatic. La'olam is dramatic. That's less dramatic. So that's question number one. What's question number one? The question number one is that basically where we resolved things with that brisa, we resolved it that it's according to Rabbi Yossi, because that's how we explained the olam. We were saying that this brisa, which says that a machshavas chutz lezmano for a kazayis made up from Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. So that means that we view Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread as one guf, and therefore they could join together, which is an issue for Rav Huna, who says that by Sarah the sheep, even though we're talking about one guf, we can treat her right leg separate from her left leg. We're treating her guf as two gufs, but if that's the case, then how can Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread join together according to Rabbi Yossi? That's question number one on Rabbi Yossi from that brisa that we've been working on. Here comes question number two out of three. Ve'od, and more so. Ha'amr of Ashi says of Ashi Tashma. Come in here. Rebbe Omer says Rebbe. Mishur Rebbe Yossi. Rebbe says in the name of Rebbe Yossi. Okay, let's see. What do you say in the name of Rebbe Yossi? Pigul b'dover anayse b'chutz pigul. When it comes to chatos achitzon, parim anisrofim, seir anisrofim. So if there was machshavas chutz lezmano by a dover anayse b'chutz, which we'll have to explain what that is, pigul. So then there's pigul. If there's machshavas chutz lezmano by dover anayse b'chutz, pigul. B'dover anayse b'fnim, lo pigul. But if the machshavas chutz lezmano was by a dover anayse b'fnim, no pigul. No, Ketzad, tell me more. Aya omed b'chutz, if he was standing in the azayre, the Amar, and he says, Areni shoichet, I'm slaughtering this, let's say parlam davar shel tzibur, I'm slaughtering this cow. Amnas lahazais midamri lemacher, with the intention of doing haza'as adam, which is in the heichal, which is bifnim, chutz lizmano, lo pigul, that's not pigul. Because we said it has to be bachutz. Shemachshava bachutz b'dover anaisa bifnim, because that was a machshava. He was standing bachutz, slaughtering the animal in the azara, having machshava about bifnim, about the haza'as adam that happens in the heichal, not pigul. Haya omed bifnim, if he was standing in the heichal, v'omer hareni mazeh, I'm gonna sprinkle the blood. Amanas lahaktir emurin l'macher v'lishpach shirayim l'macher, with the intention of burning the emurin on the mizbeach hachitzon tomorrow, or taking the leftover blood and spilling it out on the yisod on mizbeach hachitzon tomorrow. La pigul, no pigul. Shemachshav b'fnim b'davar naisa b'chutz, because it was a machshava in the heichal for something in the azar. However, oimei b'chutz, if he's standing in the azar, ve'omar, and he says, "Areni shoichet, I'm slaughtering this cow. Amanas lishpoch shirayim l'macher v'lakter emurin l'macher," with the intention of spilling the leftover blood on the mizbeach hachitzon tomorrow, or burning the emurin on the mizbeach hachitzon tomorrow. So everything's happening b'chutz. He's slaughtering the animal b'chutz, having kavana about shvichas shi'ari adam and about hektaris emurin, all of which are the shchita, the pouring of the shi'ari adam, the burning of the emurin, all of that stuff happens in the azara. Well, in that case, pigul shemachshava b'chutz b'davar naisa b'chutz, that's pigul because it was a machshavas pigul in the azara for activities that happen in the azara as well. Now, lishpoch shirayim the ipagule mai. Now, we had said that if he slaughters the paralim davar shel tzibor in the azar with the intention of pouring the leftover blood on the yisod on mizbeach hachitzon chutz lizmanu, so we said that this chatas hachitzon is pigul. Now, what about it is pigul, right? Pigul means other than it being usher, but if you eat it, you're going to be chayiv kares. Eat what? Are you going to be chayiv kares by this chatas hachitzon? No part of it is eaten. So, if we're going to say that what's pigul is that if you eat the blood, it's pigul. Meaning that if you accidentally eat the blood, so normally you'd be chayiv to being a korban chatas for eating blood by accident, but here you'd also be chayiv chatas for eating pigul by accident. But dami mipagel, but blood doesn't become pigul. You're never going to be chayiv kares for eating blood of a piguled animal. We learn in the Mishnah in Masechta Zvachim, elu dvarim she'ein chayiv leim mishum pigul. The following things, there's no chiyuv kares for eating them in terms of pigul. Hakometz, because the principle is that ein pigul ela b'davar sheish lo matirin ola adam ola mizbeach. As we know, pigul is for achilas adam or achilas mizbeach. Whether we're talking about, let's say, burning the shirayim, not burning, well, by mincha, but anyways, burning the emurin on the mizbeach, so the mizbeach consumes it, or people eating meat, you can have pigul for that. But something that's just a matir, for example, like blood, you don't eat the blood. It's not something that becomes permitted. It's davar she'ein lo matirin. The blood doesn't become permitted, and therefore you're not chayiv for eating it as pigul. You'll be chayiv for eating blood, but not for pigul. Hakometz, if somebody eats a kometz from a mincha of a levona, or the levona, the aktoris, or somebody eats aktoris, minchas kehanim, mincha of kahanim, which is entirely burnt, minchas nesachim, the mincha menachos with korbanos, which are also burnt entirely, minchas kohen Mashiach, also entirely burnt, ve'adam, and blood. Those are all examples of things that there's no pigul for. So when we say that by the chatos achitzonios, I think so, you'd be chayiv pigul for eating what? Not the blood. Elapshita leipagule baser. If one eats the meat. If you eat the meat, then you'll be chayiv kares. So here's what's interesting. We're saying that this was Rebbe quoting Rabbi Yossi. Right? We said this is Rebbe Mishum Rabbi Yossi. So whatever we're saying here is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. And what do we say here? Here, what was his machshava? His machshava, he slaughtered the animal with the machshava to pour the shiyari adam on the yisodim mizbeach chitzon chutz lizmanu. So the machshava was not about the meat. The machshava was about the shiyari adam, about blood. And yet we're saying that if you eat any part of the animal, you're going to be chayiv kares for pigul. The machshava's pigul was not about the meat. And yet, Rabbi Yossi mipagel, and Rabbi Yossi says that the meat, nonetheless, the whole animal, all of the meat, is pigul. So, the pigul b'yerich yom and pigul b'yerich small. So, then certainly, I would say that in this scenario, where the machshava is that I'm going to eat the right leg, chutz lizmano, the machshava is already about the meat. Alachas kama v'chama, that all of the meat should be pigul, right? If by the chatas achitzon, where the machshava b'chlal was about the blood, not about the meat, and yet all the meat is pigul, certainly in Rav Huna's example, where there was machshavas chutz lizmano for part of the meat, for the right leg, certainly the left leg as well as the rest of the meat, and the whole animal would also be pigul. So again, a second question on Rav Huna. And now for a third question on Rav Huna. Similar, this one is somewhat similar to the second one. Va'oda Amar Ravina, says Ravina Tashma, kometz es mincha. Somebody who takes a kometz from a mincha, lechol shiarel, o lahaktir kumtza l'macher. This was from, we learned this on yesterday's daf. In the Mishnah on yesterday's daf, we had learned that a kometz is a mincha, somebody who takes a kometz from a mincha, lechol shiarel, and the intention is to eat the shirayim, o lahaktir kumtza, or to burn the kometz l'macher chutz lizmanu. Mode Rabbi Yossi bazoi shepigel v'chayav an olav kares. Rabbi Yossi agreed over here. He admitted that we're talking about pigul, and there would be a chiyuv kares, right? Right, where he had disagreed that if the intention was to burn the levona chutz lizmanu, there he said it's possible. But in these cases, right, if he took the kometz, he scooped up the kometz with the intention of either eating the shirayim or burning the kometz chutz lizmanu, pigul. Now, and the chiyuv kares. Now, the haktir komtza, when he scoops up the kometz with the intention of burning the kometz chutz lizmanu, we said it's pigul and there's a chiyuv kares. Li paluge mai. What's it going to be chayiv kares for eating? Ilem li paluge kometz. If you're going to say, if he eats the kometz, he's going to be chayiv kares. Kometz means pagel, but are you chayiv kares for eating a kometz? The following things you're not chayiv for pigul. Ha-kometz v'chulei. The kometz. Was that the first example? Yes. Seems that was the first example. Where is this from? This one is Zvachim, Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis. The Mishnah says, pigul. Akometz is mamish the first example over there. You're not chayiv kares for eating a kometz of a pigul mincha. So ele pshita li paluga shirayim. So rather, it must be that Rabbi Yossi is admitting, he's saying that if you scoop up a kometz from a korban mincha with the intention of burning that kometz chutz lizmanu, if I then eat the shiyarei mincha, I'll be chayiv kares because it's a pigul mincha. So el pshita li paluga shirayim. Sahashto ma osam to lo choshevu b'shirayim gufei. And now we make a similar argument. If by this korban mincha, where the machshavas chutz lizmanu was not about the shiyarei mincha, it was about the burning the kometz chutz lizmanu, and yet mipagle the shiyarei mincha become pigul, and if you eat the shiyarei mincha, you're going to be chayiv kares. Hacha, when it comes to the right leg of the sheep, the chashibu bezivcha gufe, that the machshava is about the sheep, about the meat itself. Lo kol sheken, certainly all of the sheep is going to be pigul. So Rav Huna is in a tough spot. We just keep on drilling him. Rav Huna wants to say that a machshavas chutz lizmano by Sarah the sheep's right thigh has no bearing on Sarah the sheep's left thigh, but we just brought 3 questions against that notion to say that Sarah the sheep is one guf, and a machshavas chutz lizmano about Sarah the sheep's right leg is going to be a machshavas chutz lizmano about Sarah the sheep in her entirety, including her left leg. Elam Rabbi Yechanan, rather says Rabbi Yechanan, Achi Taimad Rabbi Yossi, Hainu Taimad Rabbi Yossi. This is Rabbi Yossi's pshat. Akosav ason guf echad, akosav ason shnei gufen. Rather, the following is pshat with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, of course, had said in our Mishnah that we learned, that we kicked off the daf with today, that a machsheves chutz lizmanu for Ruvain the shtei alechem has no bearing on Shimon the shtei alechem. It's for the following reason. Again, Hainu time with Rabbi Yossi. This is pshat with Rabbi Yossi. Akosav ason guf echad, akosav ason shnei gufen. The pasuk itself treats the shtei alechem as both one unit and 2 units, because the pasuk says, I'm going to read you the pasuk. So 2 breads, shnei esronim solis tiyena. That was the key word right there. Tiyena. So on the one hand it says shtayim. Shtayim means 2. On the other hand it says tiyena, which means you have to have 2. Right? They're ma'akiv. You need both of them. I.e., they're considered one unit. So on the one hand it says shtayim, 2. The other hand, we're saying they're dependent on each other, which is they're one unit. So are they 1 or are they 2? So again, hakasav ason guf echod, hakasav ason shnei gufen. They're made like 1 unit, but also 2 units. Guf echod, the me'akvi adadi. They're considered like 1 unit that you have to bring both of them, right? They have to offer both of the shtei alechem, bring both the shtei alechem. They're not burdened the mizbeach by the kohanim, but you have to bring both of them. Shnei gufen. The Amr Achmano al-Chuda Avida v'al-Chuda Avida, and they're separate. Now we say that this one is what is made separate. Right, as Rashi says, right? Okay, cholachas lishosa v'arichosa b'fnei atzma. Each one is prepared separately. Okay, fine. Now Arvinu misarvin that cause of us on guf echad. Now, if you have intention to join them together, like in that brisa that we had seen initially from Rabbi Yossi, that if he has the intention to have a kazayas together from both Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread, so we'll treat them as 1 unit, and then that's why both Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread become pigul. Palginu, however, if he divides them up, i.e. he has machshavas chutz lizmano only for Reuven the bread, mifalge, they are divided, and you'll only be chayiv pigul for Reuven the bread and not for Shimon the bread. That cause of a son shnei gufen, because the pasuk also says shtayim, that they're 2 breads, i.e. that they're separate. So it says Rabbi Yochanan, look, the pasuk by the shtei alechem treats them both as 2 separate units as well as 1 unit, and therefore, if your kavana is to treat them as 1 unit and to have a kazayas from both Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread together, so we'll treat it as 1 unit, and the whole thing will be pigul, both Reuven the bread and Shimon the bread. If you want to have machshavas chutz lizmano for only Reuven the bread and not for Shimon the bread, so we'll treat them as separate units. But in terms of having a kavana for Sarah the sheep's left leg, but not the right bread, no, not the right leg, no. All of Sarah the sheep is going to be pigul. But Rabbi Yochanan wants to know, Pigul b'lachmei toda ma'u b'mincha ma'ifra ma'u. Interesting. The lachmei toda, of course, there were 40 breads that would be offered together the korban toda, only 10 of which were chametz, the rest were not chametz. They were of 4 different types. 4 types of, I'm going to call them breads, 4 types of breads, 10 loaves of each type. Now, because there are 4 different types, what if there was machshavas chutz lizmano only for one of the types? would only that type be pigul? What about the other types? Do we say it's all coming for one korban toda, therefore it should be treated like all of it's pigul, or maybe it's just that one type of bread is pigul? Similarly, a minchas maik v'soner, an oven-baked korban mincha. There are two types of mincha maik v'soners. One is chalos, the other is rikikin. Different ways of baking them. Rikikin is more like the Ashkenazi matzahs. The chalos are, I don't know, maybe more like the Temani matzahs, but more like a little bit more doughy. Now there's a machlokes in the last Mishnah, in the 5th parak of Masechta Menachos. Machlokes between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon. The Tanakama says that the mincha mai fasoner is going to be 10 breads. The Tanakama says all 10 have to be either chalos or rakikin. Reb Shimon says 5 of them could be chalos, 5 of them could be rakikin. So according to Reb Shimon, it says 5 of them could be chalos, 5 of them could be rakikin. So what if there was machshavas chutz zmano only for the rakikin but not for the chalos, or vice versa? So again, by Rabbi Yochanan asks, Pigul b'lach metoda mau b'minchas maife mau. Does Rav Yossi also say there that the pigul could be localized to just one of the 4 types of toda breads, or to just the chalas, or just the rikikin by the maifasoner? Tanale Rav Tachlifim in my Rove taught v'chein ata omer b'lach metoda v'chein ata omer b'mincha maife, that the machlokes extends also to the lach metoda as well as to the maifasoner. That Rabbi Yossi would say the same thing there as well, that the pigul could be localized to just one of the 4 breads, or to just the chalas, or just the rikikin. And friends, now we get up to the next section of today's daf. Partial half pigul, what does that mean? Let's see. Tanar Rabbanan b'shas shchita chishev lechol chatzi zayis, v'shas zrika chishev lechol chatzi zayis pigul v'pnei shchita v'zrika mitztarfen. Okay, very interesting stuff. Person slaughtered a korban shlomin. Why not? Person slaughters a korban shlomin. When he's slaughtering it, let's say the korban, let's say the kohen slaughters it. It's just easier generally that way. The kohen slaughters a korban shlomin, and the intention when slaughtering this shlomin is that he's going to enjoy half a zayis of the meat, chutz lizmano. And then he does rikas adam on the shlomin. And he again has kavana that he's going to enjoy half a zayis of the meat, chutz lizmano. The shaila is, can the 2 half zayises, the half zayis from the shchita and the half zayis from the zrika, join together to make a kazayis such that there will be a chiyuv pigul? What do you think, friends? Again, Tanu Rabbanan b'shas shchita, when slaughtering the korban, chishev lechol chatzi zayis, he had machshavas chutz lizmano for half a zayis. V'shas zrika, and at the time of zrikas adam, chishev lechol chatzi zayis, and at zrikas adam he had machshavas chutz lizmano for another half zayis. Pigul, it is pigul mepnei shchita v'zrika mitztarfim, because shchita and zrika can be mitztarf. Rashi says because both shchita and zrika are matirin. Zrika Saddam, obviously we know Zrika Saddam of a korban shlomo would be matir, the emurin to be burnt on the mizbeach, the meat to be eaten by the kohanim, by the bailim. Now, although I guess, it would still be matir, I think by a shlom. Okay. Now Rashi says something interesting as well, which apparently we're going to learn about in 2 days from now, which is that shchita is also a type of matir, because the shchita is mekadesh the dam, and if it's mekadesh, it's also matir. Anyways, fine. So Rashi explains that because we can consider both the shchita and the zrika to be matirs, therefore they could join together, and the 2 half zayises could join together, and there's a chiyuv pigul, because there's a kazayis, it's a cumulative, there's a kavanah to the kazayis chutz lizman. Igadam the Lord says shchita v'zrika the tavayu matirin in kabbalah v'alacha lo. So one way of being medayik here is that specifically Shchita and Zrika could join together to make a full Zayis because they're both Matirin. But Kabbalah and Holacha, which are not Matirin, cannot join together to make a full Zayis. I.e., if you think Kabbalah Saddam with the intention of half a Zayis or if you think Kabbalah Saddam with the intention of half a Zayis and Holacha Saddam with the intention of half a Zayis, they would not join together. Although there's a differing perspective, Hanoch de Merachkon v'chol sheken Hani de Mekarvon. There's another perspective that say, well, if Shchita, which is the first of the 4 Avodas Adam, and Zrika, which is the 4th of the 4 Avodas Adam, can join together, Kol Shekain, Kabbalah Saddam, and Holacha Saddam, which are next to each other, steps 2 and 3, would be able to join together to create a kazayis. Ini, is this so that different steps of Avodas Adam could join together to make a full zayis? Vatoni Levi, but Levi taught Arba Avodas ein mitztarfis lepigul. The 4 avodas do not join together when it comes to pigul, shchita v'zrika kabbalah v'olacha. They cannot join together to make a full kazayis for a chiyuv pigul. So now Rave wants to say no problem, or Rebbe or Rabbanon. No big deal. Machlekes Rebbe and the Rabbanon. The Sanyo that we learn in a Braisa Shoichit as Akeves. This is a Braisa? Yeah, it is a Braisa. It's a Braisa, I thought. It's a Braisa? Okay. It's a Braisa. Shoichit as Akeves. Somebody slaughters a sheep. Right, of course, right. Reuven the sheep, Shimon the sheep, Reuven the bread, Shimon the bread. By the Shtei Alechem. Hashoichet is a keves. Somebody who slaughters Reuven the sheep, le'echol chatzi zayis michal azo, with the intention of eating half a zayis of Shimon the bread. V'chein chavero, and then he slaughters Shimon the sheep, le'echol chatzi zayis michal azo, to eat half a zayis of Shimon the bread. Rabbi Omer Ani, shezeh kosher. Rebbe says, there's nothing to be concerned about. This is a completely kosher shtei halechem. So we see that according to Rebbe, these 2 avzayises are not joining together. That's like Levi who says that the half zayises would not join together. Amle Abaye, but Abaye says to Rava, I'm not so sure about that. Emer de Shamas de Rebbe, also that Rebbe will say that the half zayis of Reuven the bread and half zayis of Shimon the bread will not join together, chatzi mater v'chatzi achila, because there we're talking about a chatzi mater and a chatzi achila. When it comes to the shtei alechem, you need, as we discussed earlier, both Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep to be offered in order to allow the shtei alechem to be eaten by the kohanim. I.e., Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep together are the matir. Reuven the sheep alone is only half of the matir. So when slaughtering Reuven the sheep with the intention of eating half a zayis of Reuven the bread, and then slaughtering Shimon the sheep with an intention of eating half a zayis of Shimon the bread, so you have for each you have half a matir and half an achila. There Rebbe would say, sorry, not mitzdarid. Kulo matir v'chatzi achila. However, in our scenario where we're talking about shchita, which is a complete matir, right? It's considered a full matir. Zrika sadam is considered a complete matir. So when we're talking about shchita, which is a full matir, and zrika, which is a full matir, and each one you have a machshava of a half a zayis, maybe they would join together. But again, kulo matir v'chatzi achila mishamislei. Maybe in that case, Rebbe would say that they would join together, and he wouldn't necessarily agree with Levi. Omelei Rav bar Rav Chanan la'Abai, but says Rav bar Rav Chanan to Abai something very interesting, which is v'i islei leRebbe kulo matir v'chatzi achila. Now, Rav bar Rav Chanan asks Abai an interesting question. He says to Abai, but look, here's the thing though. If Rebbe holds that when you have a full matir, like shchita, and half a zayis, they could join together, ligzor chatzi matir v'chatzi achila, otu kula matir v'chatzi achila. Very, very interesting question. if Rebbe holds that when you have a full matir and half an achila, they could join together since we're talking about a full matir, but then if that were the case, then Rebbe should not say that it's kosher, which he does say it's kosher, when you have half a matir and half an achila, right? We said that when you have machshava by Reuven the sheep, about half a zayis of Reuven the bread, and by Shimon the sheep, about half a zayis of Shimon the bread, they're not mitzdarif and it's completely kosher. But he should at least be gozer, he should make a gezerah, he should say, well, even though technically speaking there's no issue with half a matir and half a achila, but still, out of concern for when it's a full matir and half a achila, out of concern for that scenario, we should at least make a gezerah by half a matir and half an achila, and say that it's possible. Because afterwards Rabbi Yossi gazer for Rabbanon gazer, because after all we see that Rabbi Yossi made similar gezeras and the Rabbanon made similar gezeras. Rabbi Yossi gazer, where was the scenario where Rabbi Yossi made a gezerah? The Tanah that we learned in the mission that we learned yesterday. Lahakti levonoso limocher, that if one scoops up a kometz of a mincha with the intention of burning the levona michutz lizmano. So now Rebbe had said that there's no pigul by in this scenario, right? Ein matir mefagel matir, right? When it comes to a kor mincha, both the kometz and the levona are matir the shiari mincha, and therefore the avoda by one matir, the kometz is not going to be mefagel another matir, the levona. So really, be'etzim, there's no there's no iser pigul when it comes to levona, and yet Rabbi Yossi Omer Posel Ve'im Bokaris. Rabbi Yossi doesn't just say it's mutter that when there's machshava of burning the levona michutz lizmano. He doesn't say it's kosher. He doesn't say it's mutter, even though technically it's not pigul. So why should it be posel? Nonetheless, he says posel is a gezerah. Posel ve'im Bokaris. V'cham pigul v'chayven alav karis. Whereas the Chum say nonetheless it's pigul and you are chayv karis. But why does Rabbi Yossi nonetheless say that it is posel? Out of concern for the scenario where there is pigul, right? If you scoop up the kometz with the intention of burning the kometz chutz lizmano, so there is a chiv pigul. So therefore, even though when it comes to burning the levona chutz lizmano there is no pigul, he still says nonetheless it's posel. So we see that even though in the scenario of burning the levona, according to Rabbi Yossi, there is no pigul at all, he still makes a gezerah. He says that it's possible. Virabban, the rabbis, nami gazer ditnan, that we learn in a Mishnah and Daf Zayin, pigul bekometz v'lo balevona, that if there was pigul by the kometz but not by the levona, right? Both the kometz and the levona are matir, the sharia mincha. And the Chacham say if it was a machshavas pigul by the kometz but not by the levona, by levona v'lo b'kometz, or for the levona and not the kometz. Reb Meir Omer pigul v'chayven alav karis. Reb Meir says nonetheless it's pigul because he says mefaglim b'chatzi matir. V'chachamam ein bo karis ad sheyfagel b'chol hamatir. The Chacham say there's no chiyuv karis until you have machshavas chutz lizmano both by the kometz as well as by the levona. You'd have to have machshavas chutz lizmano by the entire matir. Now they say that there's no chiyuv karis, but it would still nonetheless be possible. So we see that when it comes to kind of playing with fire like this, even if there's technically no pigul in this particular scenario, we'll see that Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim both nonetheless said possible, they were still gozer. Whereas if Rebbe were to say that that the kazayis is joined together when there's a full matir, he should at least make a gezerah when there's half a matir. Amalei, to which Abai responds to Rav Abai of Chanan, Hachihashta b'shlama hasam. I understand by Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon, Gazer Rabbi Yossi kometz the levona, to kometz the mincha. I understand Rabbi Yossi says that that if you scoop up the Kitoria, if you scoop up the kometz with machshavas chutz lizmano by the levona, it's still going to be possible nonetheless, because if you would do the same with machshavas chutz lizmano for the kometz, it would be pigul. And therefore, since right? Komets levana out to komets the mincha. Since he would have machshavas chutz zmanu by the komets of the mincha, by the komets, it would be pigul. So we also says at least by the komets of the levana, even though it's not pigul, it's still possible because we're playing with fire a little bit. Rabbanan gazri komets out to komets the minchas chote. V'levana to levana abba b'vazichin. And the rabbis who say that if there's machshavas chutz zmanu by just the komets or by just the levana, they still say pasul, even though they say ein mefagim b'chatzi matir. Still, they say because when you have just the komets, so that would be enough to be mefagel by a minchas chote, by minchas chote where there is no levona. So then the komets is the full matir, and having machshavas chutz zmanu by the komets, I don't know what I just said. By the minchas chote, there's only a komets, there's no levona. Therefore, the komets is the full matir, and therefore, in that scenario, having machshavas chutz zmanu by the komets would be a chiyuv pigul. So therefore, even when there is levona, they still say, even though it's chatzi matir, they still say it's pasul. And by the levona as well, by the bazichin, the bazichin of the lechem upon him is the full matir. There's no komets there. It's all about the bazichin. And since over there, machshavas chutz zmanu by the bazichin would be pigul, so also in a scenario where there's a komets as well, and technically the bazichin is only chatzi matir, still, they would say that it's at least pasul. Kvasim nami, also by the Reuven the sheep and Shimon the sheep by the shtei alechem, keves atu keves chavero, they still say that if you have machshavas chutz zmanu by one of the kvasim, it's still going to be pasul out of concern for when you have machshavas chutz zmanu by both of the kvasim. Baza chatu baza chavero, also even if you have machshavas chutz zmanu by one of the bazichin by the shtei alechem, out of concern for when you have machshavas chutz zmanu for both of the bazichin. So Elahocha, but says Abai, but in this case, with the chatzi matir and the chatzi achila, mi'ika chatzi matir v'chatzi achila ba'alma, is there any other scenario of chatzi matir and chatzi achila that you'd be chayiv for to leikum v'ligzer that we should say here that Rebbe should make a gezerah? So says Abai to Rav Abai Rav Chanan, if you want to say to me that Rebbe should make a gezerah, and you bring these examples from Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon, I understand why Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon are making gezerahs, because there's real equivalent things to be concerned about. Right? By the Rabbi, for example, Rabbi Yossi Shita, when you scoop up a komets with the intention of chutz zmanu by the levona, which there's no pigul, but if that you did the same thing, but instead of the levona, you had the machshava to burn the komets, then it would be pigul. There's a very subtle difference there. So therefore, I understand why Rabbi Yossi would make gezerah. But there isn't actually another scenario of chatzi matir and chatzi achila that there would be a chiyuv pigul, and therefore says Abaye, there wouldn't be a reason for Rebbe to make such a gezerah. This also makes sense. The Talmud Rabbanon mishum hachihu, that this is the reason for the rabbis making their gezerah. The Katani Sefer, because it says at the end of the Mishnah on Daf Tes Zayin, Modem Chacham to Rav Meir, that the Chacham admit to Rav Meir the minchas chote and minchas knos, that when it comes to minchas chote and minchas knos, she in pigul bekomets, that if he has machshavas chutz zmanu by the komets, shepigul v'chayav olive cars, that it's pigul and there's a chiyuv cars. She'akomets hu amatir, because the komets is the matir. Halamali lemisna klau. Why do I have to say this? Pshita, obviously, that if the komets is the matir, there's going to be pigul. Miika matir achrina, there's no other matir. Of course, it's pigul. Elo lav all kamashman, is it not that why are the rabbis going out of the way to say this? Because they're clarifying the time of the komets mishum deika. Komets the minchas chote de damila, that the reason why by the komets when there's levona they still make a gezerah even though it's a chatzi matir is because you see in this case by the minchas chote when this is the only matir and there's a chiyuv pigul, so they point out that you see we're going to say over here even though we said by the when there's a komets and levona, we said that we made a gzer and we said that it's possible because you see over here we would say that there's a chiyuv kares for pigul when it comes to minchas chote because it is the full matir. And that's coming to explain why they would say when there's kometz and levona, when it's half the matir, we're still going to make a gezerah out of concern for when it's the whole matir. However, when it comes to chatzi matir and chatzi achila, there's no other scenario where there would be a chiyuv pigul, and therefore Abaye argues that Rebbe really wouldn't have to make a gezerah there. In which case, getting back to the question of, we had one brisa saying that half a kazai is by the shechita and half a kazai is by the zrika can join together, and Levi says they can't join together. So we haven't, Rava wanted to say that, well, Levi is just some machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim, but we apparently, Abaye kind of pushed back on that, and apparently we're not necessarily going to say that. Friends, that was Daf Yudal, Daf 14 of Masechta. I was about to say Yevamis, but it's Menachos. Wow, friends, these dafs are getting long. The first week of Menachos, the dafs managed to be within an hour. I think now we're starting to get into over an hour territory, friends. Anyways, partial pigul. When you have pigul, for example, when you have machshavas chutz zmana, for example, by one of the shtei alechem. So the rabbis say all pigul. Even if you have machshavas chutz zmana for Ruvain the bread, Shimon the bread is also pigul. Now Rabbi Yossi had said there can be partial pigul. Rabbi Yossi had said that you can have machshavas chutz zmana just for Ruvain the bread, and only Ruvain the bread would be pigul. Shimon the bread would not. Rav Huna wanted to say that you can even localize it to a leg, right? You have Sarah the sheep. You can even have machshavas chutz zmana just for Sarah the sheep's right leg, while keeping the left leg unpiggled. But then we asked a whole bunch of kashas. That was the whole discussion on the first Amud. And ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan said, no, you can't localize it to a leg. But by the shtei alechem, we said because sometimes the pasuk refers to it as 1 unit, sometimes it's 2 units. So depending on what your kavana is, you can isolate Ruvain the bread from Shimon the bread, or you can join them together. Now, partial af pigul, we had 2 conflicting brises. One that said blood avodas can join together, certainly at least the shchita and the zrika sadam. There's a question about the kabbalah sadam and the holacha sadam. The other brisa, however, said, quoted by Levi, said that blood avodas can not join together. We got into a whole discussion about Rebbe and gezeres and things, but ultimately I think we just have these conflicting brises and conflicting opinions. We didn't exactly resolve whose opinions are what. Friends, that was Daf Yudal of Masechta Menachos. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.